He's got everything set and ready to go.
I've been getting shot.
No bothering at all.
My bad eye every.
All right, the Lord be with you. Let's go ahead and pray. O Lord our God, as we come together to meditate on your word, we ask that you would open our hearts and our minds, that we can take this text and struggle with it, work with it, understand what it is that you have to teach us through it, and that our lives and our faith in your Son, Christ our Lord, might be strengthened. We ask this through his name. Amen. Okay, so where have we been? Let's get a quick 5-minute or less catch-up over the last couple of weeks.
Don't say ketchup around a tomato.
Okay, great. That's not helpful. Appreciate it.
Matthew 26.
Yep, we're in Matthew. Should be in, I believe, chapter 27.
Oh, sorry.
I think we're in 27.
27, I apologize. Yeah.
So we're in Matthew 27. For those of us who missed a week or two, what's happened up to this point? What's the main heading of this set of chapters?
Crucifixion of Jesus.
There we go. All right. So we have basically done. We've pretty much finished Maundy, Thursday. We covered the institution of the Lord's Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane. We've moved scenes. So in this part of Matthew, it's really helpful because we are in such a compressed period of time. So it's helpful to think kind of like a play or a drama and think in scenes. So we're in particular places as we're moving around, right? So the first place that we start out for our kind of Paschal season, if you will, is the upper room. We're up in the upper room, we're having the Passover meal, Jesus, the disciples, institution of the Lord's Supper. Then they go from there to where? What's the next scene in our drama? The garden, yes, exactly. And so in the garden, Jesus prays. He spends time with his disciples. They're on their way. They're singing a hymn. They get there. They spend some time. Jesus goes off a little bit further with just a couple of disciples and then goes a little further and has his time in prayer. In that time in prayer, he goes back and forth and says, hey, how come you guys can't stay awake? What's going on? It's not so hard. Then, who shows up? Judas and the boys. They show up and they're here to ruin the party. And they take Jesus to, they take him to the religious leaders first. So he goes to the house of Annas first and then Caiaphas next, because Annas is the father of the chief priests, and then he goes to the chief priest for that particular year, who happened to be Caiaphas. And then we go from there and we're bouncing around town. We're going to, depending on which gospel you're reading, at this point you might go to Herod's, you might go to Pilate's, you might go Pilate to Herod, back to Pilate. You're bouncing around. But we saw first the religious leaders, and then the next scene is the secular leaders, the government officials. And we are finishing up with the next scene after that, which is Calvary or Golgotha. So in 3 minutes, we just summarized a day and a half's worth of stuff. Basically just looking at it as scenes throughout the city of Jerusalem. None of these places are all that far from each other. I was blessed beyond measure by the seminary to be able to actually go to Israel in the summer between my first and second year, the summer of 2019, and we actually traveled a lot of this space in just a couple of hours.
Did you focus on the tomb at the garden or the sepulchre?
We simply recognized that there is church tradition for all of the above, and didn't worry necessarily about the actual key spots, and worried more about following the narrative of the text and seeing examples of things and experiencing kind of the movements of space and place.
Via Della Rosa.
So we did not take the full walk, but we did see the sepulcher. We did see the Mount of Olives / the Garden of Gethsemane. We kind of moved around to these different places. And so as you're doing so, you're really not moving very far, but it's a very big difference in scene and in what's going on, and in the dialogue between Jesus and the disciples, between Jesus and the church leaders, Jesus and the religious, or the civic leaders. All of these places are very different spaces, very different occurrences. And now we're at the Mount of the Crucifixion, which is outside of the city to some degree. How far? We don't know, but it's kind of along a road or along a route that people would have been going into Jerusalem, so people would have seen this. Crucifixion, as I mentioned in the sermon, used to be very common, isn't common today, obviously. But when it was common, they used it not only as a form of capital punishment, it was also a means of intimidation. So you were, if someone were crucified, they were not just crucified as a way to put them to death publicly. This was an execution with the intent of passing along a message. Think of your favorite mob movie. When you do something with the deceased to prove a point, to leave a message, to let people know this isn't the kind of stuff we're okay with. That's what the Roman government did. When they crucified somebody, it wasn't just to kill that person. It wasn't just simply lethal injection and we're done. This was, I've got a message and you're not going to get this. And so Jesus was put to death for basically being an insurrectionist. Basically, the Jews brought certain charges against him. The Jews said, this man claims to be the Son of God. But in order for Pilate to do it, he really needed to do this under the pretense that this guy is inciting rebellion. He is making unrest. He is causing other people to do things, and if we don't do this, there could be a riot. And that's really most likely what's going on in his mind, is because he's thinking to himself, I can't have another riot. I need to show that I can keep control of the people. And so this Jesus is that we're going to be crucifying, we're going to be able to take care of this, and we're good to go. We're going to put this Jesus to death, and it's going to quash any kind of a rebellion, any kind of armed revolt or anything like that, unrest amongst the Jewish people. We're just going to do what they want. It'll all be fine. Make sense? So now we are at, I believe, verse 54-ish. Is that right?
I left my glasses at home.
I think we're about verse 54 with the centurion and his buddies. Chapter 27. Chapter 27, verse 54. So if I can get somebody who'd read 54 through 56, that would be great. 54 to 56.
Now when the centurion and they that were with them watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly this was the Son of God. And many women were there beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto them, among which was Mary Magdalene, and Mary and mother of Jesus, James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's children.
Okay, can you read 56 one more time?
Among which Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Jose, and the mother of Zebedee's children.
Okay, great. Perfect. It sounded like you read the mother of Jesus, James, and Joseph, and I wanted to make sure that your version didn't have that. Okay, because that's kind of important.
Yeah.
So, what jumps out at everybody as we're seeing these couple of verses read? So 54 to 56, what do we see? What jumps out at you? What do you notice in those couple of verses? This is the part where if you don't participate, it's going to be really boring.
Jesus was God.
Okay, so we get the centurion and the centurion's guy's confession. Good.
Yeah. Was it earthquake?
There was an earthquake. Yep.
There were physical manifestations that they saw were unlikely to be coincidences.
Okay. So there was more than just an earthquake, but there were multiple physical, terrestrial things happening. What else?
That there's a lot of Marys at that time.
Okay. Yep. Lots of Marys at the time.
That kind of confuses me a little bit sometimes.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, they all witnessed him die.
Okay. So everybody saw the same thing. And yet, we have kind of different reactions or different actions happening alongside the seeing of the same event. Okay, good, excellent, wonderful. So, let's jump into the text. So verse 54, we have what type of observer? Do we have a believing observer or a non-believing observer? So we have a non-believing observer. We tend to, in the Gospels, call those guys Gentiles. So we have a Gentile observer, a non-Jewish, non-Christian person being a Gentile. So we have a Gentile observer who's seeing Jesus be put to death, and how does he respond?
Surely this was the Son of God.
Surely this man was the Son of God. Okay, so Matthew oftentimes likes to take people who we don't expect to give us key insights and information, and they see. They notice things. They understand things. They come to realize. I think we had a question over here.
Well, I was just observing that it makes them more credible eyewitnesses.
Okay.
Because to somebody who already felt that way beforehand, one would say, oh, well, of course you're going to say
Right.
that. When you
Sure.
see somebody who was not a follower and now is stating what he's witnessed, that's a more credible eyewitness in the mind of
There is absolutely a credibility factor. You're taking someone who's outside, who has not been a follower, and that person has something to say.
Question, is this the same soldier that Jesus healed his servant?
We don't know. So, what we do know, the question was, is this the same soldier who Jesus healed the child of? And we don't know if that's the case or not, because a centurion was simply basically an officer in the Roman army. So, centurion, century, 100. A centurion was a person who was in charge of 100 soldiers. So they were kind of like a company commander in the army today. So they have 100 or so guys who they're in charge of, and they are responsible for that group of individuals. So this guy has a smaller group, most likely, at the cross, at the crucifixion. But it does say the centurion and those with him. So there was at least a few non-believing Gentile people who were at the foot of the cross. We have a handful of Romans who are there, who are participating in this. And the interesting thing about the Romans is that we know that they would have been polytheists. They would have believed in this idea of many gods. But he doesn't say this man is a son of God. He says this man is the Son of God. And even if you go back and look at the Greek, you get a situation where it's possible that it could be a son of a God, but it's really unlikely based on the context around everything. So it's really uncommon, it's really unlikely that what they're saying in this particular instance, especially with what we've seen when Jesus says that he is, or when the charges are read that he is claimed that he is the Son of God. The Jews levy those charges. You have the Jewish contention that he is the Son, or the Romans who are saying that he is the Son. Now in this case, does it really make sense that they would say that he's a son of a God? Not so much. So Matthew doesn't necessarily include making it explicit that that's the case, but it's pretty clear from the context that this is a centurion making a truth claim about Jesus, saying, this man's the Son of God. He's saying that not only for the benefit of those around him, but as a general confession of faith when confronted with the reality that this guy is doing something. There's something happening here, and the reason for that, as we've mentioned, is the previous moments of physical activity. The terrestrial reaction to the Prince of Creation, the King of Creation, being murdered. We see tombs being rent open. We see earthquakes. We see darkness. All these different physical manifestations occurring in the space immediately around where Jesus is being crucified actively. So the King of Creation is being killed, and creation can't help but react violently. And then we have this confession from the centurion and from his, likely from those who are with him. He's saying this kind of in a group. Oftentimes Matthew also acts that way. He will identify one person to be kind of the speaker of a group. So when Matthew will say things like, Peter said such and such and such, oftentimes the disciples were probably saying it or thinking it too, but Peter's actually the one who said it. So more often than not, he's representative of all 12 of the disciples together. So it's very possible that this is a realization that all of those centurion and his men who were there were coming to the realization of. There's not textual, claim to that, but it would fit Matthew's style the way that he writes.
I kind of wonder whether he said it in a way that he meant to be quoted, or whether Matthew, the author, just kind of overheard him saying it and then included it. Because he really took his life in his hands if he was making a public proclamation as a centurion. He could have been put to death for making such a statement.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
Showed a lot of bravery.
There certainly is probably kind of a statement of shock and surprise, but also of confession kind of all mixed in together. So it's not necessarily maybe that this is Peter's confession on the lake saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, but it's probably one of those moments where he's overcome by the overwhelming nature of what's going on. He's seeing all these things and he's like, oh my gosh. In a shocked state, this man really was the Son of God. And we also do get was. We do get a past tense. This guy sees what's happening, recognizes what's happening, and says, in the past, he was the Son of God.
Or maybe by that time, Jesus is already dead.
Exactly. So we have a recognition of his death, and kind of a statement about who Jesus is, was, and will be, but not a recognition of a continuing state, not this trust in any kind of a resurrection, nothing like that. So we don't get a fullness of comprehension from the centurion and his men because they haven't been following Jesus. They don't have a reason to know, to understand, to experience that Jesus has said that he's going to rise again. Now, we've spent a lot of time in verse 54, but verse 55 centers on whom?
The women.
The women. All right. So what do we know from this particular text, these words, what do we know about this woman, these women? We know names, but what do we know about what they've done, who they are, where they've been?
Well,
Says they found from Galilee.
They're followers from Galilee. And what was their purpose?
to serve him.
To serve Jesus. Okay. So we have women whose names have been recorded in the text from Galilee, and their purpose was to serve Jesus. Where are they?
Foot of the cross.
Watching from a distance.
They were not at the foot of the cross. They were watching from a distance.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
So, watching from a distance. Who else in this narrative play, narrative drama, if you will, at one point in time was watching from a distance? Who did we see watch from a distance previously?
Mary Magdalene.
No.
The guy.
The guy. That's correct, but which guy? And where? Think about the religious leader's trial that was being put on. Peter. Yeah. Peter was watching from a distance. Now we have the women watching from a distance, and we don't have any mention of any of his disciples, of any other believers being at the foot of the cross, being anywhere near this. Now, other gospel accounts, and this is the difficulty when you're reading narratives that you're familiar with and narratives that are covered in multiple different places. Because if I put 4 people at 4 different corners of an intersection and have you guys watching a crash, you're all going to write about it a little bit differently. But what's going on here in Matthew is the focus of our study, and so that's what we want to spend our time with. So what does Matthew tell us? Matthew tells us that the women were watching from afar. Do we have any mention of the disciples? Do we have any mention of any other women or believers being anywhere else around the cross? No. Jesus has been forsaken. In Matthew's gospel, the focus of what he's writing about is the forsakenness of those who believe and who have been traveling with and working with Jesus, and the fact that they are not with him. We had one over here, and then I'll come over there.
Well, again, you want us to focus on Matthew, so it's not
Correct.
mentioned in Matthew, but we do know that John was there because he was the one who your mother...
Sure, correct. But again, Matthew's focus at this point is on the fact that we don't have that going on. We're not recording who's with him at the foot because what we are focusing instead on is the forsakenness. We get the only mention of believing people who've traveled with Jesus is being from afar. So that is our mention of who we've got there. So what do we got?
No, that was what I was going to say.
Yeah.
His mother was there.
Well, and that's the thing, is that we have different gospels that say different things about the same encounter. And the reason for that is because we're focusing on different aspects of what's going on. So if I put the 4 of you at 4 different corners of an intersection, some of you are going to take note of what color the car was. Some of you are going to take note of what model the car was, or what year the car was, or what color the light was, or who was crossing the street walking the opposite direction at the same time. None of you are going to be wrong. You're focusing on different aspects of the incident. And so that's what's going on here. We have different accounts, not because any of them are wrong or because they're unfaithful or because they don't work together, but because they're working with different things that they're trying to outline, highlight, and draw to our attention. And in Matthew, we really want to see this forsaken quality. So that's why in verses 45 and 46, 47, we have got his cry of dereliction. Why have you forsaken me, God? We are drawing attention to the fact that Jesus is being completely and utterly forsaken. Now, just a few verses later, as if to walk hand in hand with Jesus' own claim against God, we have that the women are watching from a distance. And so we're drawing attention to that spatial separation, the fact that these women are the only true believers that are being identified in this particular section, apart from the recent confession of the centurion, and they're a distance away, they're being separated, they're not immediately there present for what's going on.
Well, if I could make a comment on, and I know Peter is not specifically mentioned right here as watching from afar, we have discussed it, and it occurs to me at this point, because we know the whole story, we know the end. I think at this point, because we know the end, we really lose sight of the fact that Peter had denied him 3 times, and he felt like he was outside of grace at this point.
Yeah.
And while a couple of these disciples, they're kind of close enough for Jesus to address, Peter was not comfortable because he hadn't been reinstated yet. I mean, Jesus, after the resurrection, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you 3 times.
Yeah.
But until that happens, Peter, feeling of himself, he's not worthy to even be at the foot of the cross.
Yeah.
Because he just denied Jesus.
Sure. And now that requires a little bit of a step. We have to kind of assume a mental state of someone, which is challenging because we don't really get a lot of those moments in Scripture where people tell us why someone did what they did. We're going to look at Pilate here in a little bit with the burial, and we're not going to get any discussion of his inner thoughts of his ideas, of what's going on in his head. And so it's hard to do that with any certainty. But yeah, we can assume that he has disowned Jesus those 3 times, and he will soon, in a few days, be reinstated. But in that interim period, I can imagine what I would feel like. And I think it would be reasonable to assume the same of a guy like Peter, who has been following Jesus, who's been going with him and working with him and been following along. And now all of a sudden, things are being done a little bit differently, and he's not listed in any gospel account as being present. So while we want to kind of restrain ourselves to Matthew, we can think about the fact that none of the gospels say that Peter's there. And that is an interesting note because Peter has been so central to everything else. Now, as for the women, what are the names of the women that are there? We have number 1, Mary Magdalene. Number 2,
Mary, the mother of James and Joseph.
Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. And number 3, the mother of Zebedee. So, who do, according to Matthew, we have Mary, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So we have those 3 people. Now, do we have any statement either affirming or denying Mary, the mother of Jesus' presence at this point? Not necessarily. Mary is an incredibly common name. We've mentioned that a couple of times. Mary is a ridiculously common name. There are a lot of Marys out there. We know some names of some of Jesus' family members. Some of those brothers that people like to say, well, were they really brothers, or were they cousins, or were they, half-brothers? What was really going on here? No, okay. It doesn't matter what you call them. We know some of those names. And we know that James was one of those names. It's likely that Joseph could have been one of those names because Joseph was Jesus' father. So if Joseph and Mary had other kids, maybe there was another Joseph. But those are also both still very common names. So Matthew leaves it ambiguous in this particular text. We have other instances from other gospel accounts where we know that Jesus looks on his mother, says, "Mother, behold your son, son, behold your mother," but this is not here. In this text, we have a second ambiguous Mary. This could be Mary, the mother of Jesus. This may not be Mary, the mother of Jesus. We don't know. But we know that we've got a Mary, we've got another Mary, and we have who? Another mother. Let's think back to Matthew chapter 20. Flip there if you need to. Right after the parable of the workers in the vineyard, what mother comes to Jesus with a particular request? The mother of the sons of Zebedee. Okay, so in Matthew chapter 20, we have the mother of the sons of Zebedee making a particular request, and that request is what?
To have Jesus, or to have her sons one on the right.
Lord, grant to my sons a place on your right and a place on your left. Now, we have the mother of Zebedee watching from afar, and what is she seeing? That there are people who are crucified at his right hand and at his left.
Do you really want your sons to be there?
This is the reality of the ruling and reigning, the work for which Christ has been sent to do. This action, this is the culmination of Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry is the kingdom of heaven. If we were on the 3-year lectionary, the last couple of weeks, you'd have been hearing different parables about the kingdom of heaven and what the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, Jesus, in one of those parables, says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who's out in a field, finds a treasure, buries the treasure, goes and sells all he has, and comes back and buys it. A couple weeks ago, when I was preaching on this text, I pointed out that earlier in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And the only thing that's changed from the time before he started saying that and the time that he started saying that was the fact that he started his ministry. Jesus' ministry is the rule and reign of the kingdom of heaven. This action, this high point, this climax is the moment where the rule and reign is made both most clear for anyone who's reading and understanding, and at the same time, the most muddied for everyone else. Because those religious leaders who have been mocking him and have been saying all this other stuff, they don't understand that this is the high point of his reigning. The other thing is that we have the note that the women have been, or were there, had been around to do what? To serve him. Well, that shows that they don't really understand what's going on. Because what did Jesus come to do?
Service.
Not to be served, but to serve. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And that's what we're seeing here. They still don't get it. They still don't understand. They're watching in sorrow from afar. They don't get it. So we have these Gentile non-believers at the foot of the cross who, for all intents and purposes, are receiving a brand new message that they've not necessarily been exposed to and are realizing this man must be the Son of God. And then we have people who've supposedly been around seeing this confession, seeing this ministry, seeing this mission, seeing this work over and over, time and time again. And what do we arrive at? Nothing. They're sitting off on the sidelines. There's no expression of hope. There's no affirmation that they believe and realize and recognize that Jesus is going to rise again because he said he was going to. Obviously, other people besides his disciples had come to become aware of that message. We're going to find that out in the next couple of verses when the religious leaders go to Pilate. So other people had at least heard of this prophecy that Jesus was going to be raised up again. And yet that hope in the resurrection, that trust in the word of Jesus, that faithfulness is just, it doesn't seem to be on display here.
Yeah, I think the women that went to take care of Jesus' body on that Easter Sunday.
Well, hold on, we're not quite there yet. We don't want to jump too far ahead. We don't want to get to the tomb yet because we haven't even gotten him off the cross yet. We got to get there first. But keep that in mind, because what also are we going to have here in a few minutes? We're going to have witnesses to where Jesus was laid.
If you don't mind, can I hear her thought, though?
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to say that, the women didn't realize, whoever the woman was that went, Mary, I think it was one of Mary Magdalene. But anyway, they get there and they didn't realize, like you said, from their standing from afar here, that until they got to the tomb and the angel spoke to them. So even up to that point, they had no idea. They were just oblivious to what was going on.
This
That's
is
all I was gonna say.
this is a durative kind of unawareness. A lack of awareness, a lack of either knowing or trusting that Jesus said he was going to be raised again. And right now it looks like everybody's kind of lost hope.
Right.
We don't have much hope and faith in a resurrection. We're kind of seemingly overcome by the grief, and we're going about things, and we'll see this in a second, we're going about things in the same way as we would expect anybody else to die.
Well, I was just going to say, to paraphrase, whether it be the people who've been following him for years, that's heard every word out of his mouth, or the people who haven't been following him, who haven't heard a single word out of his mouth, nobody gets it.
Nobody gets the fullness of it. Yes, right. But you would say that in this moment, it is interesting that the act of one is an act of confession and faithfulness. The act of the other is one of watching from afar and of kind of an not getting it necessarily.
And the one who made the statement of faithfulness was the one who hadn't been following.
Correct. And that's what Matthew's trying to point out. Matthew is again trying to it's kind of an example of from the mouths of babes. These people who have no understanding are the ones who are giving us the true confession. We have examples of this throughout Matthew's gospel when we get various people of low standing or people of no standing within the Jewish community who are making statements of faith and affirmation about Jesus.
So often Gentiles.
Yeah. we might have a Gentile centurion who comes to have his servant or his daughter saved. We might have an official who comes to have a daughter saved. We might have a woman who's drawing water from a well in the middle of the hot part of the day because she's an outcast of Samaritan society who says, I found the one about whom Moses and the prophets have written.
A woman in Sidon.
We have all these instances, and several of these instances are written about in Matthew because Matthew really wants to draw our attention to the fact, again, we want to contain ourselves to this gospel. Matthew wants to draw our attention to the fact that the people who aren't supposed to get it are the ones who are. And the people who should have every reason to understand it seem to be missing the bigger point. So really often, the disciples end up looking like dummies throughout the Gospel of Matthew because they just don't get it.
Do you think that's another example of shaming the wise? That the ones who weren't educated, the ones who hadn't been hearing the message, it's almost revealed through faith to them. But the one who would consider themselves so smart and educated and having studied all these things, they're the ones that are the most blessed.
Yeah, there is a sense in which this is just kind of the way God works. He reveals himself in unexpected ways to unexpected people. He works in unexpected means. We can go back to Isaiah. Our ways and your ways don't line up. So God's ways are not our ways. We don't understand the way that he does things, why he does things a certain way. But he has a plan. He knows what he's doing. It's not like it's, just some random string of occurrences. There's a reason for it. We're working that way. So we end with the mother of Zebedee's sons looking out, and she's thinking, if I'm, putting myself in that spot, I'm remembering what request I made of Jesus, saying, put my sons on your right and your left, and now I'm seeing two criminals being crucified on his right hand and on his left. And all of these disciples, per church tradition, except for one, are going to experience a martyr's death. They're going to die in similar ways to this. Not all of them are going to be crucified, but 11 of the 12 disciples, according to church tradition, experience some form of martyrdom, death for the faith. So they're going to receive this kind of treatment in their final days, but this is what she's seeing. She's seeing someone on Jesus' right and on Jesus' left as he is entering into, as that kingdom is drawing near to all of the people in this moment.
I wonder if she was embarrassed or remembered that she had just asked that question just a few days prior.
Yeah, possibly.
All that, she's like, ooh, I should have said that.
Yeah, there's a way in which we kind of see this. She doesn't know what she's asking for, and now she's seeing what she was asking for. And Jesus, what does Jesus answer when he says this? He says, those places aren't mine to give. And so he's now revealing the fullness kind of what's going on. As he's entering into his rule and his reign, these people, again, one believing, one not, who are being crucified with him, are being, an image to this mother, to see what it is that she was asking for, what she doesn't realize, what she's now seeing in front of her. So let's move on to the burial section, 57, and this goes all the way 57 to 61. We should get that far, but in case we don't, that'll get left for Pastor next week. We've got about 20 minutes left. Because we started a few minutes early. I'm going to contain ourselves to the hour, even though we could take an hour and 15. We're going to contain ourselves to the hour. So if I can get somebody who'd be willing to read 57 to 61, a new reader. All right, nice and loud for us.
As the evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to Joseph. He took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb.
Yep.
See it, sorry. he rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb.
Okay. So, what jumps out? What do we see?
That he's a ruler in the church
Okay.
at the time, and
How do we see that? How do we see that?
well, because he was, Joseph of Arimathea was one of the Jewish leaders
From this part of the text, or do we know that from somewhere else?
somewhere else.
Okay. Just making sure we're pointing out that that's not here directly, but Joseph of Arimathea.
Went to visit Jesus, and because he asked the question, how can I be saved? And Jesus says, well, you have to be born again.
Oh, that was Nicodemus.
Oh, sorry.
You're thinking
Person.
the wrong guy.
Forgive me, everyone.
Well, we know he's a believer.
But we do know that he does believe, and he's a rich man.
Yeah.
So,
It was fairly courageous to go to Pilate and ask for Jesus' body. That took courage.
Okay.
That took guts.
yep. What else pops up?
Out of just that one verse.
Out of these couple of verses. Yeah. Yep. 57 to 61. So just a 4-verse section.
It's interesting, in this section, it does not refer to this new tomb as being Joseph's tomb. We know that from other places in Scripture, but you wouldn't learn it here.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it says
It does say, though, that he placed it in his own tomb.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
which he had cut in the rock.
Yeah, verse 60 says that it was his own tomb. You're fine. So we've got the tomb. All right.
Clean cloth. It was.
Clean cloth. Okay.
I would imagine clean would have been new on you.
Yeah, that would have been part of the burial custom of the day. So that was standard burial practice. What else we got? Anything else?
Yeah, I'm surprised. He rolled a great stone at the entrance.
Well, he
Well,
had a great stone rolled. You know, he may not have done it himself, but he might have had people do it for him. If he's a rich man, he probably had servants.
yeah.
Well, and guards, if there were guards. there.
Well, we don't have guards yet.
Okay.
We don't have any guards yet. We've
I
got
just assumed that when they took the body, there would be a
well,
group of
as
soldiers.
of right now, what we've got is Pilate had ordered the body removed, and it was given then to Joseph. We don't have any other notes up to this point saying who did the removing, did they go back and break legs. Those are other gospel accounts. And so we want to, again, suspend our knowledge of the story because we want to continue working through Matthew's text on Matthew's text's account. So that's a really important thing that we really want to do with Matthew and Mark and Luke. And anytime you're reading a specific gospel, the best way to go about doing it is just to read that gospel and to suspend, because then we start to pull in details from other places. And we start to think about things that are supplied elsewhere that we don't know from here. And Matthew has very particular emphases that he's trying to make, and we miss some of that if we are pulling pieces from everywhere else. So we don't have any note of how the bodies were taken down. We don't have the note about the taking or the breaking of the legs of the other criminals, but the fact that Jesus was already dead, the stabbing on the side, all these different things, those are other gospel accounts. So we just want to kind of hold off, keep those just at arm's length, and let Matthew roll in. But there is still one really important note that we haven't mentioned yet, and it's in verse 61.
2 Marys were there.
But where were they?
Sitting right across from
They were across from the tomb. Why is this important?
so they knew where to go the next day.
One of the big critiques that gets levied about the story of Jesus is that people didn't know what tomb to go to. They went to the wrong tomb, and of course it was empty because they went to the wrong one. Do you really think verse 61 ended up there by accident? No. They were across the way watching where the body was laying so that they could go back. We know they're going to go back. We know that's what's getting ready to happen. Matthew's going to tell us that in just a few short pages. We know that's getting ready to happen. They were sitting there. They knew where the body was laying. They knew exactly which tomb to go to. There wasn't any question. All right, great. So, those things jumped out at us. There's quite a few things here. Evening's approaching. Where are we in the timeline of events? This is the close of what day, though?
Friday.
Yeah. So we're getting ready to get to sundown on Friday. Now, what happens at sundown on Friday in Jewish homes?
Passover.
No, that's one particular time, but every Friday what happens? Sabbath. Yeah. So the Sabbath is getting ready to start. And now the reason this particular Sabbath is so important is because it coincided with the celebration of the Passover. So this is the Passover Sabbath. So Passover and Sabbath are two different things. Passover would have taken place over a longer period of time. It was a couple of day celebration that would have been going on. But this is the Passover's Sabbath. This is the Sabbath belonging to the Passover. And this is a big, important moment. Yeah.
Well, and I was just going to mention context. In the Jewish culture, at the close of the day, or as you approach the close of the day on Friday, they're frantically trying to make their final preparations.
Yep.
So whether you got everything in place or not, when that sun sets on Friday night,
Yep.
stop. Everything stops. You don't do anything.
Well, and you've already got it. I mean, you already need to be home.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to be out and about still at this point.
It's not like, maybe we'll do this because it's one less thing we got to do tomorrow. So,
No.
oh my God, the sun's almost down.
Yeah, you're making sure you have what you need. You're making sure your family's home. You're making sure you've got your stuff ready to go. And depending on where in St. Louis you live, you may still see this going on. I mean, for 4 years, I lived in a neighborhood in U City that was primarily Orthodox Jews. And every Friday night, people were driving home quickly to make sure that they were home before the sun went down because they had to get in. They had to make sure everything was ready for the Passover. They had to make sure that the family was ready to go, that they, were ready for synagogue and everything else, because when it's time, it's time.
I just wondered, as a neighbor, did they get to have lights, or did they have candlelight?
So they normally they kind of cheated. They turned their lights on Friday before the sun went down. So they left their lights on everywhere, basically, but their bedrooms.
Can I just mention one other thing?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't mean to take my
No, you're fine.
A lot of people, again, and you think about the big stone, and everybody always pictures this big, massive boulder. But they were smart people back then. They didn't have the technology, but they were still smart.
Mhm.
And in front of these tombs that they would carve out of the mountain, you'd have a channel also carved
Yep.
in the rock. And this large stone is not a round globe, it's a flat disc.
Yeah.
It rolls in this channel, and
Yeah.
roll it in this channel.
So this wasn't all that uncommon to do either.
So it's very large and it's very heavy.
Yeah.
It's not a globe holder. It's a
Right.
disc. This is a
Yeah.
engineered.
This is somewhat common practice, because if you think about what's going to happen when you start putting a body in a hole in the rock, what's going to happen?
It'll disintegrate.
Well, it's going to start to stink. And it's not going to take all that long either.
I meant the boulder.
Oh, I'm talking about the body. So the body is going to start to stink. And you're going to start to get some smell. And so you're going to put some kind of a stone in front just to block that decay. The other thing is, if you keep in mind, what were the purification laws for the Jews? Could you go past a dead body like that? No. Why did 2 out of the 3 people walk past in the Good Samaritan? Because they thought he was dead. They didn't want to become unclean because they had responsibilities and duties. What happened with Lazarus? Lazarus had a stone put in front of his tomb. All these things are because as the body starts to decay, as the body is lying dead, you're now dealing with a potential purification problem. And so that's why all this stuff is happening as we're getting closer to sundown on Friday. because we're inching closer and closer to Sabbath, and we don't want to be unclean when Sabbath rolls around, because then we won't be allowed to eat the Sabbath meal with our family. We'll have to be excluded from that. So it's the same reason, if you remember from some of our accounts, that certain people didn't go into certain parts of Pilate's palace, because they didn't want to become unclean from associating with a Gentile. So you're seeing all these cleanliness things, and Joseph of Arimathea is kind of pushing it all the way up to the edge. He's kind of like, this is getting tense. We're getting tight on time. But we're still getting to the point where he still does what he thinks is right. He still does what he thinks he needs to do, which is to provide the body of his Lord a respectful and reverential place of rest. There's no evidence that Joseph of Arimathea believes that Jesus is going to rise based on this. We still have to recognize the great sacrifice that this would have been for him. He put Jesus in a new tomb. Tombs were reserved for families. Putting Jesus in his new tomb meant that Joseph wasn't going to be using this tomb anymore. It wasn't really Joseph's tomb at this point, because lying Jesus in state in this tomb now meant that it belonged to Jesus and Jesus' family. And since Jesus had no wife and kids, seems like that might be an issue. We have to recognize that this is a big deal. And Joseph did this and moved him there, and other people saw where he was placed, and a stone was rolled in front of the grave. All of these things are being done in the standard practice of Jewish burial. So even these people who should theoretically know Joseph has become a disciple. It's a kind of passive verb. If you look in the ESV, it's interesting because they're going to make it an indicative verb, and that I know that's a really boring grammatical term, but they're going to say that Joseph was a disciple. And that just seems like, there might be this kind of long-term, he was kind of from the beginning, but this is, I think, a better rendering of it. He had become a disciple. At some point in the, maybe not recent past, but at some point, he had been convinced by what he had heard and seen. He had become a disciple. He wasn't one who had started out a disciple and continued along this whole process. He had become a disciple.
Do you know where Arimathea is in relation to Jerusalem?
I do not, unfortunately. I wish I did. I wish my map was a little bit better in my head.
Also, it says on my tablet that who also Jesus' disciples came. So there were, I don't know if they were all there, that they all came. 57.
Okay, 57.
When evening had come, a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself was also Jesus' disciple.
Oh, so that's just a different version of the same thing. That's not saying that any more of the disciples came with him. That's just another version of saying the same thing, which is basically that Joseph at some point had become a disciple. So we have Jesus in his Joseph at some point had become a disciple of Jesus.
Well, something you said kind of struck a nerve. The Lord provides. These are all examples of the Lord provides. Because Jesus didn't have the family. He didn't have the kids or a wife or the brother or somebody that were going to make sure that all these things were done and done properly. They all happened and they were all done properly, but it was all by divine...
Yeah, it was all by provision. Yeah. And the other thing is again, like you mentioned, Joseph does something that his own family and his own disciples don't do. You would think that Jesus' family or Jesus' disciples, the people who had been traveling with him, who'd heard these prophecies, would be the ones who would go there and say, hey, give us the body, we want to bury Jesus. But instead, that's not what happens. We get someone else coming from an outside perspective who then does this. And he provides all that's necessary and needful to be able to do this in accordance with Jewish law. But again, we have another example of it doesn't seem like there's any indication that he thinks that Jesus is actually going to rise. Because he's doing things that he would for a normal body, under normal circumstances, in the normal way of doing things. So for verses 62 to 65, I'll just go ahead and read it. We've got about 5 minutes left, and if you want to leave after 5 minutes, great. If you want to stay a few extra minutes to just finish the chapter, I'm happy to do so too. The next day, the one after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that the deceiver said, after 3 days I'll rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. What do we see? What do we notice?
The Jewish leadership still scurrying about to, however you want to characterize it.
There's still a concern amongst those Jewish leaders. Yes, good point. What else?
It'd be worse than the last.
Okay, so they're concerned that if something happens and Jesus isn't there in 3 days, the hubbub is going to be worse than the last time. Okay, what else? Does anybody have an ESV Bible, by the way? Could you read for me verse 65?
I'm looking at a map before I do that. Jerusalem, Arimathea is about 60 kilometers northeast of Jerusalem.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
but by a little ways too. So we're talking probably 30, somewhere between 25 and 35 miles away probably. So 65 if you don't mind.
What am I looking for? Matthew 27?
Matthew 27:65 in the ESV.
ESV, okay.
Yep.
I got the ESV. What verse is it?
65. 27:65.
Okay. Pilate said to them, you have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard.
Okay. So I just wanted to hear the ESV because I think at times when people hear it put that way, what might they think? When Pilate says you have a guard, go and do. What might you think is going on? Well, maybe.
That all this was being directed by Pilate and not the Jewish leadership?
Maybe.
Something to do with the guard and never mind.
Well, so one of the things that I have seen said is that that verse is that the Jews had some kind of a temple guard or a Sadducees like militia kind of thing, and that's what they took. And I wanted to point out that this NIV reading, take a guard, is a little bit more helpful because it points out that's not the case. What's really going on here is that Pilate is giving them people. Pilate is providing. That's more, you have a guard is more a command than just a regular old-fashioned statement. It's not, hey, you guys have your own people, so go get this done. This is, no, you have a guard. Do what you need to do. I'm going to give you the authority to do what you need to do, which is important because after the resurrection, what's going to happen with those guards? Well, they become like dead men, and they're going to be in trouble because the body's gone. So who's going to speak on their behalf? The religious leaders. And why do they need to do that if these are religious guards? If these are religious guards, fine, no big deal. You're not subject to Pilate. But if you're Pilate's guards, if you're Roman soldiers, that makes a big difference because now you're responsible and you're going to have to answer to this guy. And so that's why their involvement is going to be important. So I just want to point out, these are not temple guards. These are Roman soldiers who are being stationed at the tomb.
And that also speaks to credibility.
Correct.
These guys not only have no motivation to lie,
Right.
it cost them their lives.
Correct.
They have the report.
Correct. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different things happening. So interestingly enough, in most versions, verse 62 is going to talk about the next day, the one after the preparation day. Why would Matthew not say on the Sabbath day?
That wasn't the Sabbath day back then.
The day after the preparation would have been the day of the Sabbath.
He wasn't Jewish.
Well, Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience, most likely. The day after so the preparation day would have been the day before the Sabbath. The day after, the one after the preparation day, which would have been the Sabbath day. So why didn't he just say on the Sabbath day? And this is entirely conjecture, so this is my own thoughts and opinions. So you can take it or leave it. But Jesus talks about how man was made for the Sabbath, or man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath restrictions and regulations and rules aren't what they used to be now that Jesus has come. His ministry, his witness, his work that he's doing, he is in the process of undoing and fulfilling everything that needs to be done. The regulation of the Sabbath no longer holds the same strictures that it did before. So, that's my personal reading of this text, because he doesn't use the word that you would expect him to use. And words mean things, and there's a reason that Matthew would choose to do this. So why would you not use the word that everyone's expecting you to use unless you're trying to make a point that it's not important that it's the Sabbath? The Sabbath doesn't mean the same thing that it used to mean. Now, all of a sudden, the Sabbath is more importantly the day that people went, the day after preparation, and then we're going to get on the first day of the week shortly thereafter.
Would this not also make them even more hypocritical than they already are, because they're doing technically work on the Sabbath?
There is stuff being done on the Sabbath.
Putting him to death for cold reasons,
But again,
breaking their own laws.
what is Matthew doing here? He doesn't draw attention to that. He doesn't draw attention to the fact that it's the Sabbath and they're doing work, because he draws attention to the fact that it's the day after the day of preparation. The Sabbath doesn't pop up in here. Exactly. And so, sir, we remember what he said, that it was still alive. He said after 3 days he's going to rise again. They have heard the prophecy that Jesus had originally only made to his disciples. That word has gotten out. People have heard this. We also have the Pharisees and the chief priests.
That kind of goes back to your comment about Joseph of Arimathea, because if he didn't expect him to rise, but as he just mentioned, that was out there. People knew that.
People were starting to hear this, yeah.
So he had heard it possibly, but didn't believe it.
And see, that's the thing, is that the women possibly heard it, the others possibly heard it, but the disciples definitely had heard it. The disciples should have known this, and the disciples should have been waiting and ready, but they're scared instead. So it's a showing of a lack of trust, a lack of belief, a lack of faith on their part in what's going on. But that note, the Pharisees and the chief priests. The Sadducees and the Pharisees, we kind of paint them with a broad brush as always Jesus' primary opponents, right? That's kind of...
They're not on the same side.
But they were never on the same side of things. This is the one example in all of everything that I've ever read, this fighting about Jesus. This is the only time these guys agreed on anything. They were so good at not agreeing with each other. That was their job. The Pharisees were basically a bunch of religious lawyers, basically. They were rule people, but they were all lay people. They weren't from the priestly class. They weren't religious elites in any way whatsoever. The Sadducees' power came from the fact that they were directly linked to the temple. They were the religious elite.
Were they part of the Levites, the Sadducees?
I believe that their power and authority was linked up with that, yes. So their connection is from being with the temple and they're primarily focused on Jerusalem and on the temple and on everything else. They are religious elites. They're not lay people. So these two groups of people who are very different, have very different foci, have very different attempts at leading and ruling and control and wanting things to be done their way, get together to stop Jesus. And they're doing it again at the end of verse 27 because this is so important to them. We don't want anything to happen that can undermine our credibility. We killed this guy because he claimed that he was the Son of God. If he's vindicated, this whole system's going to go up in smoke. This whole thing is going to get messed up. So we really need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Pilate gives them the soldiers that they need to seal the tomb, to make it secure, and we're going to find out what happens next. Putting a seal on the stone, it might have been some kind of a physical wax sealing. That's possible, but it's also just as possible that you can think of this as putting up police tape around a crime scene. It may have just been that they put a note on the tomb that said, nobody's allowed to come over here. We don't know exactly what methods and means they used to seal the tomb, but we know that it was under guard, and we know that it was in some way sealed so that people weren't going to come messing, and 3 days later something was going to happen. So when we get together next week, I'm going to send Pastor a note after church and everything today. We will be on chapter 28. Chapter 28, verse 1. If there's any lingering questions, I'd be happy to stick around for a few minutes, but I think we pretty well covered everything we needed to cover. So we got all the way to the end of the chapter, and we did it in an hour and 4 minutes. So I'm okay with that. So let's go ahead and close in prayer real quick, and then if there are any final questions, I'll stick around. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for the opportunity to gather around your word. We give you thanks for the fact that we were able to be here for both church and Bible class, that you were able to speak to us through the scriptures, and that we were able to learn a great deal, to understand more about the work that your Son did for our benefit, for our salvation. We ask that as we continue throughout this week, that you would keep that in our minds and in our hearts, that we would continue to meditate and rest in your word on a constant basis. We ask this through your Son. Amen.